Welcome to part 3. In this video I'm going to show you how to write tests for these loading observables, and we're also going to implement the other two public methods on the API service. So first things first, let's take a look at the loading property. I'm actually going to move this to a getter function. We're going to see later it's going to be easier to spy on the data of the behavior subject here. So we can do get loading. I want that to be an observable of Boolean, and I'm going to just get rid of that. Switch back to the tests, and I'm going to describe loading, and it should return loading status. So first we'll define the marbles, and what I'm expecting to happen is we're going to have the endpoints as one set of marbles, and then the other is going to be the expected outcome. So what I'm hoping is to say some time passes, and then we have some data. So loading in this example, loading endpoints is the data that we're going to be mocking. So it could be an empty array, which then we'd expect to be false. I like to use F and T for true and false. It just makes it a little easier to read for me. And then some more time passes, and then we get a different array, which we'll define as B here. And then that's going to be true because the array is going to contain some data. So let's spy on our loading endpoints private method, private property, to return that data. So we've got spies, and we're going to spy on, and this is, I don't know, this is the way I found out how to do it. It doesn't seem ideal, but we're going to go service, loading endpoints, and we want to spy on the property of as observable, and here, and we want to return value, and here we're going to have a hot observable, which is going to have the endpoints as the marbles. And there, as you can see up here, we've got A and B as data. So A, I want it to be false, so I'm going to have an empty array. And then B, we're going to have some endpoints in this instance. So we've got endpoint 1, and we'll say endpoint 2. So that's our data spied on. And now with that data, I'm going to expect loading. So service.loading. I can call it like this because I'm using the getter there. To be observable, and this should be a cold observable with the expected outcome, and then I want to define the data here, so T is true and F is false. So that's what I'm expecting, an empty array to return false and an array with two items in to return true. So let's go and implement that now. So what we want to do is return this loading endpoints, and we want to use the as observable function on that, which at the moment will just return exactly what we put in. So if we have an empty array here, it's going to output an empty array, which we may be able to see in the tests here. Yeah, so we're expecting false and true, but instead we've got an array, an empty array there, and then here we have an array with endpoint 1 and 2. So that's looking promising. Now all we need to do is pipe our data and call a map operator. So map is going to take the loading, it's going to take a function, which I'm going to pass in a parameter of loading endpoints, which, as you can see here, is an array of strings. So if I have a length greater than 0, then it's going to return true if it's if that length is greater than 0, which actually passes our test for us. So if we switch back, we can see. And now if I wanted to test this again, more time can pass, and we've got A, it fails, and then all this time can pass, and then we get a false output, just like that. Just going to get rid of that. And now we want to write tests for this method, loading endpoints. Which actually I need to pass in a parameter of endpoints, which is going to be an array of string. So this is going to tell us if any of these endpoints in this array that we pass are in the current loading endpoints observable. So let's see how we do that. we can actually duplicate this loading test case because it's going to be quite similar. Loading endpoints, and I'm just going to move that next to it. So loading endpoints should return loading status. So we'll pass loading endpoints here. And the only difference is we're going to now pass in an array, and I'm going to pass in an array with one item, endpoint 1. And we want these tests to pass again as they are. So when A is emitted with no items in array, then we want it to be false. And then when B is emitted and we've got endpoint 1 and 2, B is emitted here, we want it to be true. And that's because we want we're passing in endpoint 1, so we want this to match the fact that that's in there. If I was to pass in endpoint 100, I'd want that to be false, which we'll write some tests for in a second. But at the moment, let's make this one pass. So back to our loading endpoints. We want to start from the same base as before, loading endpoints as observable, and let's pipe the output of that. First, I want to map loading endpoints. So I basically want to take loading endpoints and I want to filter out anything which isn't included in our endpoints array, and I can use the lodash function includes there, and also I can filter over the array. So I'm inside my map function at the moment, and I'm going to pass it filter, and I'm going to take the loading endpoints array, and then the second argument for filter is going to map over each one of these items in the array. So I can take loading endpoints and I take off the S. Oh. And I want to return true if includes. So the string, which is loading endpoints, is included in my array of endpoints. Now we can look at a pretty nifty Wallaby feature. So I'm going to just run tap here so I can just output any data. So I want to see, let's have a look at data. And I can console log data. And Wallaby is just going to show me the output in line here. So we've got one empty array and one array of endpoint 1, and that's because we have passed in data here. A, we had an empty array, and then for B, we have the 2 items in the array, but we filtered them out by checking if our endpoints is included in the array we pass in. So now, to make our test pass, just like before, I just need to map the output of these loading endpoints, like that, and check if the length is greater than 0. And if so, we should get passing tests, as you'll see there. I'll just take this out because we don't need that anymore. So, perfect. Now, we're going to have to write another test here to check for other instances. Because we're passing in a static value here, we can't use the endpoints that we pass in as an observable. So I'm just going to duplicate this test. And I'm going to write should return loading status when multiple endpoints are passed in. So let's take a look at this. We'll modify the data slightly. So we'll have endpoint 1, endpoint 2. So I would expect that to be passing right now, although I did notice this was underlined, so I'm wondering if our parameters are the wrong way around. Yes, they are, yeah. So search element from index. So that's the search element, it's endpoints. And then from index, yeah, there. So yeah, I've just switched those around. So now we're checking if endpoints contains loading endpoint, which is the string, which it does. And in this case, yeah, cool. Let's do another test where we pass in parameters that don't match anything. So endpoint 100, like that. So now we're going to have data empty, so it should return false as expected. And then B, we've got endpoint 1 and endpoint 2, but we're looking for endpoint 100, so that should return false, and should return loading status where multiple endpoints are passed in. Should return possibly false loading status when non-matching endpoints are passed in. Okay, now let's implement the last 2 public methods. So we've got getUser and getUserSettings. These are going to be pretty simple. All they're going to do is call our private method call here. So let's write the tests for those. I'm just going to collapse. I've used Command Shift minus, and that collapses all my tests, makes them a little easier to read like that. And I'm going to copy loading because it's going to be similar. and we're going to call it get. Is it get user? Yeah. And should return a user. Oh, it should call .call. So I'm just going to get rid of all of this. So let's define our marbles, and we're going to have the expected, which is going to pass some time and then some data, and we're also going to have the call, which is going to time and data. So now let's spy. We want to spy on service as any, because we're spying on private, spying on call, and we want to return value cold observable because it's not subscribed to, expected. No, sorry, that should be cool. And in this case, it's okay if we just pass a string as a, because we're just going to mock this method. In this instance, we'd normally run an HTTP post request and we'll get data from the endpoint, but we're just saying give us a string called a as an observable. So we've got the any here. So let's go back, and we're going to expect service dot get user. We're going to pass in the username as well. Username, and this should be an observable cold, and we're going to have the expected parameters. Okay, so that should be the test. Basically, we make the call, with return some data, and then we expect that data there. So let's write that. So return this dot call, and we are going to pass in options, the endpoint, which is going to be get user in this instance, and we're actually going to define body because we want to pass in that username. Body, so let's define that in our service call options. Body can be an object, and here we're going to have body username, just like that. So we're going to pass in the username as an object. Done, and we can see tests are passing already as expected, but I just want to make sure that call has been called with the correct parameters. So we want to expect that service, and it's private, so call to have been called once, and to have been called with these parameters here, get user, and then I'll just pass in username like that. So we've got passing tests, and get user settings is going to be pretty much identical, except we're going to call get user settings. We're not going to pass in any parameters, and that means that we won't define a body option here as well. So let's just make body optional, and then I can copy this, delete body, and test the passing. So that is our API service fully implemented and ready to use with ngrx-effects and our components on the next videos.